All right, thank you, Nandini. First of all, I want to thank Del and Jordan for the invite to this, and to the workshop last year, and to Maura for the sleek organization. Though I've really heard some of these papers before, I think a lot of new stuff is really coming out, which proves the old adage that you can never step into the same Zoom window twice. So I was particularly floored yesterday, actually, in the discussion after Joe's paper, where Joe, when he was getting a bit Feeney and a bit Law MacDonald and Padilla Peralta in Empire of Plunder, when he tied the birth of Latin literature to the influx of literate Greek slaves. And it left me with a sort of sobering thought that has been hanging over me, and maybe we want to discuss at some point. And that sobering thought is, what if most of the fiddly Greek-centric intertextuality that we attribute to cognitively superhuman Latin authors is really the fruit of a huge team of enslaved Greek research assistants come co-authors? I think that's sort of where Joe's stuff was going, and it's it's a chilling thought, and puts a whole different complexion on Latin literature. So I really enjoyed that. Anyway, the paper that I'm going to give now is, it had a previous work life in an earlier workshop under Del and Jordan's brand, and it had another iteration at UCLA. And I've sort of tried to learn from those exchanges, and I'm gonna change it up a little bit. So the basic ideas are similar, but at least the words and the focal passages have changed. For most of us knowledge workers doing our thing in exploitative institutions, work is far from a metaphor. It's a painful, literal reality. Just because we work, mostly by pumping thoughts through our brains, extending and reformulating those thoughts with students and colleagues, then punching those thoughts into Word documents and polishing them into slides, it doesn't make the work any less work. It's certainly my personal conviction, and maybe shared by others in the Zoomy room, that for meaningful political work to take place, for these crystals of solidarity to properly form, the conception of work and worker must be as capacious as possible. It must encompass all those who have no choice but to sell their labor for a wage, whether that labor be cleaning toilets or tidying up PowerPoints. And yet, and I can only speak for myself here, this necessary conflation of work and worker for the sake of solidarity still leaves a significant residue of white-collar guilt. How can the work I am doing right now, talking to you about the finer points of a Latin poem on the latest Mac paid for by the good University of St Andrews, using a PowerPoint that I can't even use, how can that work count as real work next to the daily work of ploughing a hoover across vast fields of office carpet? So when I say I'm working, am I really using a metaphor? Am I really committing a theft in language to equate two things which should not be equated? To quote Del again, are these things not the same? It's these different kinds of work and the work of metaphor connecting them, which I'd like to talk about today, apropos of this promised Latin poem, the Maritum. The core questions are these. Now, what kinds of real work, which I cheekily and unprofessionally use in its common sense meaning of manual labor, can be turned through the magic of metaphor into aesthetic work, the work of art? And what kinds of real work can't be metaphorized so easily from the mundane to the celestial? And what might all this tell us about the relationship between the cleaner and the poet, or better yet, what does it tell us about Roman work and our work if any such relationship is denied? So the Maritum is a gem of a poem. It's an anonymous 122 hexameter poem bundled up in the Appendix Virgiliana, and it treats the early morning breakfast prep of the peasant Simulus and his enslaved companion Cybele in the bleary sliver of day between waking and ploughing. And the action, which I've given you briefly on that slide, the action is simple. Simulus gets up, he makes bread, He digs in the garden for herbs and garlic. He whacks them in the mortar, just add olive oil, and bingo, you got yourself a perfectly acceptable pesto to line the stomach for a hard day in the fields. What isn't simple is the mode in which this humble activity, perhaps the longest and most focused treatment of peasant activity to survive from antiquity, in fact, is treated. The poem's tone is notoriously tough to nail, exacerbated by the gaping void in authorship, the sort of basic orientation which might usually guide our assessment of the poem's politics. So is it that rarest of artisanal objects from antiquity? Is it a genuine, sympathetic, honest, and kind treatment of the hard life of the rural poor? Or is it rather a satire through reductio ad absurdum on the way elite hexameter writers, aka Virgil, tend to lionize humility in their verse? Or is the core work of the poem, making pesto, the eponymous Maritum, actually about something else entirely? Is it about making poetry? Does it manifest the material work of making poetry, as William Fitzgerald has shown? And I've given you some references at the end of the presentation. So I'll send it if you want to chase them up later. So is it about sort of materializing the work of poetry, as William Fitzgerald has suggested? Or is it perhaps about sublimating a sexual relationship between the two protagonists of the poem, as Francesca Bellet has recently spotted? So the question is there work in this work, or is it, as usual in Latin poetry, instantly spirited away into quote unquote work? So Joe Howley, friend of the Work Life Gang and expert on the ideology of enslaved labor, has cooked up this very helpful concept, which he introduced us to yesterday, of the epistemic firewall, which is set up to silo different forms of work from each other and to keep certain human beings excluded from certain kinds of knowledge and labor. Joe has shown brilliantly how hard enslavers fight to keep white collar and blue collar work quarantined from each other in their management of enslaved agricultural staff. So there are distinct limits set on the cognitive and the epistemic capacities of the slave, and these boundaries are policed with sort of particularly intense intellectual tasers, precisely at the moment where an enslaved figure threatens to cross the boundary from body to mind, as happens with the Willicus, the slave entrusted with the management of the enslaver's estate when he, as usual, is away carousing in the big smoke. What I'd like to show in these next few minutes in Howleyan terms is this, that the Maritum's remarkable dynamism as a poem stems partly from its erection of not one, but two epistemic firewalls across both intra and extradiegetic relationships. So broadly speaking, the first firewall is the gendered break between Simulus and Cybele. So the former, Simulus, is allowed to pass over through metaphor into the world of what Fitzgerald calls the hymimetic or the epic mode, and he's allowed to have artwork made of his labor. The latter, Cybele, is completely denied the boosting capacity of metaphor to allow a redemptive crossover between social realms. So that's, so much for firewall one. The second firewall stands between Simulus and the poet. For though Simulus is permitted the baby steps of the artist, it's clear that he does not see his work as art. For that transmutation to take place, the luxury subjectivity of the poet, unacknowledged minter of metaphorical currency, is necessary. So really, there are three stages in a sort of hierarchy punctuated by heavily tended firewalls. Cybele, who is condemned to remain in a world without metaphor. Simulus, who can be metaphorized but cannot use metaphors himself. And then the poet, who is gifted the power of hanging back and turning work into work. Okay, so the last iteration of this paper, I committed the rookie error of putting too much quintillion in, and this is the next slide. Nandini, thanks. So I committed the rookie error of putting too much of that in, and you'll be happy to know that I learned my lesson. But just to flash this up for old time's sake before I dive into a different part of the Maritim from last time. So this quintillion passage is phenomenal, and it's what got my mind originally racing, because it's about the class connotations of using metaphor in language. So for quintillion, not everyone has the cognitive or the educational, i.e. material resources to use metaphor properly. So metaphor, ironically, metaphorically, is a matter of property. It's about moving a term from its own proper place to a place where there is no proper term, or the transferred term works better than the proper term. So in some ways, this is, it's almost a form of settler colonial thinking. As a proprietor of language, you move one verbal pawn into a new area where supposedly no one is living, and you expand and you claim it, and eventually that becomes your property too. So quintillion renders this capacity for metaphor making markedly unevenly distributed, from these rustici at the bottom, these country folk who just use metaphor because they have to, they're living hand to mouth, there's no alternative. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are the big poets at the top who use metaphor deliberately, self-consciously, luxuriantly, unnecessarily. So where the really impressive metaphor comes in, says quintillion, is precisely where there's an element of being surplus to requirements. And one of the ways you can flex your muscle as a posh enricher of language is by bringing the low high through metaphor, like Virgil does in the last bit of the quintillion passage, where Virgil euphemizes horse sex in this language of higher brow agricultural fertility. So it's this process of bringing high through metaphor, but also on the other hand, keeping low by literalism, that I think characterizes the work of the Maritim. Okay, so that's all a bit abstract. So to show you what I mean, let's compare a few moments in this poem where Simulus and Cybele, the two protagonists, appear side by side. And here I'm very much going to reheat and add a few condiments to William Fitzgerald's classic 1996 article, Labor and Laborer in Latin Poetry. I'd like to pay attention particularly to what we might call the skewed distribution of metaphorical wealth between the protagonists. So perhaps the clearest example of this falls early in the poem. At the moment Cybele is first introduced, Simulus has woken up, fumbled for the fire, swept off the mill, and now he's setting about making some bread. Now check out how the discourse changes when the focus moves from hero Simulus to housemaid Cybele. And I'll just read this passage. So next, he summons his hands to the work. This is the work of milling, which he allots to this side or to that. The left is devoted to supplying the grain, the right to plying the mill. The right hand in constant circles turns and drives the wheel. The grain, bruised by the stone's swift blows, runs down. The left, at intervals, relieves her wearied sister and changes places. Now he sings rustic songs and with rude strains solaces his toil. At times he shouts to Cybele. She was his only help, African by race, her whole appearance proclaiming her native land, her hair curly, her lips swollen, and her complexion dark. She was wide-chested with breasts hanging low, her belly somewhat pinched, her legs thin, her feet broad and ample. Her he calls and bids her place fuel on the fire to burn, and over the flame heat cold water. Okay, so Simulus's body is here turned into a multiply staffed organization headed by Simulus himself. So the arrangement between his individual hands working the mill in fact sort of reflects the division of labor which we'll see in his own relationship with Cybele. So we've got one hand, the slightly icky left hand, charged with the supplementary devalued task of being the help, ministerio, and the other hand, the right hand, the heroic hand, given the real work of driving the mill. So metaphor and metonymy, I think, expand the operation. So this grain isn't just grain, it's keres, it's a serial version of the goddess herself. And the hands themselves become anthropomorphized. So they become sisters, helping each other out. It seems that everything around Simulus is enjoying a kind of aesthetic promotion. Even the man himself is allowed the first fruits of poetic production, singing his rustic songs, using verse to lighten his load, sum solator laborem, which is a version of what the poet is doing to him. Okay, but then suddenly the register shifts, and then the metaphors come to a screeching halt. So Simulus had been doing real art, making bread, singing along the way, until he's shunted back to the realm of the literal by yelling an order to Cybele. Now cue the famous description of Cybele, which is a very rare detail. Oh, sorry, stay on that passage, Nandini, thanks. Yeah, so now cue, the famous description of Cybele, which is a very rare detailed depiction of an enslaved North African person, which some scholars used to think of as a kind of exoticizing stereotype, until Shelley Haley stepped in and showed us that it's often, the translator who's exoticizing rather than the poet. And I think, she's very right to point that out, and I've given you her alternative translation on the slide. I'm deeply indebted to Haley for pointing out, white scholars' tendency to make Cybele's situation sort of look worse than it actually is. And I'm really indebted to Francesca Bellet, who's recently built even more on Haley's redemptive reading, partly by calling out what Bellet calls the white male gaze fixation with Cybele's oppression. So I'm very worried that I'm taking things backwards a little bit here in my reading, but humbly and hesitantly, I'm not sure I would go so far as Haley to re-inject Black pride into the language here. The bodily description of Cybele seems to me quite flat, anatomizing, a bit more scientific than sexualizing. And I think this shift in tone is precisely the point. So while Simulus's body is exaggerated in the most OTT fashion, his hands suddenly sprout bodies all of their own, and they become additional women workers in his production team. Cybele is parceled into bits of body that are just that, nothing more. They're denied the promotion of metaphor. They're denied the animation of anthropomorphosis. In fact, Cybele is stuck fast in the realm of the literal. Her whole figure screams her birthplace in Africa. Indeed, she can't be anything else. So just as in Fitzgerald's terms, she isn't allowed to enter the realm of the hymenetic, so also is she unable to break through to this world of metaphor. She looks like an African woman, and her body parts don't get to be anything but those. So what you see, allegedly, is what you get. So throughout this poem, this dialectic between expansion and contraction, and Nandini, you can go to the next slide now, thank you. This dialectic between expansion and contraction, raising and keeping in place, metaphor and its denial, sticks to Simulus and Cybele, even in moments where it feels a little gratuitous. And it becomes clearer that these unequal metaphor rights map quite neatly onto the division of labor I hinted at above. So take this moment where Simulus applies the finishing touches to the bread and pops that bread in the oven. This is the passage on the slide. And now he lifts the kneaded mixture and with open palms spreads it out into its rounded shape, which he marks into quadrants, stamped out at equal intervals. Then he puts it in the hearth. Cybele had first cleaned a suitable place and covers it with tiles, heaping up the fire above. And with heat and hearth playing their part, Simulus, meanwhile, is not slack in that idle hour, but seeks for himself another resource. And lest bread by itself should displease his palate, he gathers dainties to flavor it. So again, this workaday task of Simulus becomes, in poets' charitable hands, high-level work. So it's dubbed opus, and opus is a word which gets a real workout in this poem to refer to Simulus's menial projects. So this work, opus, is also a work of marking which is tantamount to writing, this verb notat. So Simulus in this process, he's kind of adding value, he infert, he superagerat ignes, he's heaping this on. And again, the metonymy offers some help with Vulcan and Vesta doing their bit parts, and even Ceres again making another cameo here. So in fact, while the former gods are busy performing their role of cook, Simulus busies himself with other tasks. So it's almost as if they're all of these beings, Vulcan, Vesta, and Simulus, they're almost part of the same plane of household operation. But what about Cybele? Cybele, on the other hand, barely gets a line, and that line is parenthetically inserted. Cybele mundavere raptum antelocum. This is exactly the kind of flat epexegetic insertion that could be written off as an interpolation, were it not completely necessary to the politics I'm trying to tease out here. So the point is, again, that the moment Cybele steps in, the curtain of aestheticizing metaphor slips away. Descriptive statement comes back in, and we get verbs like mundaverat, spoiling the fun. So mundare, this verb is actually quite rare, but it's only attested elsewhere in prose, and we can sort of compare the slightly more dignified collocation in line 42, emundata ceres. Okay, so when Simulus gets to purify the grain, it's called emundata. Anyway, so cleaning grain, kneading and dividing the dough, putting it in the oven, letting it cook, all of those activities of Simulus can be flung to the heights by metaphor, but the person who doesn't respond to metaphor, or more accurately, the person who doesn't even receive the call to be metaphorized, is this enslaved woman called Cybele. And her name, quite literally means piece of shit, not to beat her about the bush. So with a nominal brand like that on her, Cybele bears this stigma of being mimetically, metaphorically unassimilable and indigestible. Okay, we've only just scratched the surface on metaphor in the Maritim, but I want to finish up on a passage that complicates what I've been saying, or maybe points to a different dimension to it. So far, I've tried to show how uneven clusters of metaphor, a trope which is the poetic sign of aesthetic valuation par excellence, are matched with the way certain work and workers are valued in the poem. So Simulus's bread making, but also his other activities, which I haven't had time to go into, say gardening and pesto making, all of those can be raised through metaphor. And while I said the poet is the one doing the metaphorizing, and therein lies that second firewall I was talking about, I think there's also a few hints over the course of the poem that this primitivized peasant is also starting to think, which is something that I probably underplayed in the last version of the paper. So as we saw, Simulus can sing poetry to lighten his load of work. I think that's important. And in line 85, which I haven't had a chance to talk about, he can actually think and plan. So the poet uses this phrase, aliquid meditans. He's thinking about something. He's meditari. So meditor is this kind of mental activity that you need to compose poetry, famous in the opening to Horace Satires 1:9, when he's nescioquid meditans. He's thinking about some poetry. So even if Simulus is aliquid, that he's meditans over there, even if that only consists of thoughts about vegetables or what he wants from his garden, he's at least meditans. Okay, so there are some very entry-level hints, in other words, of this inchoate subjectivity and interiority. Cybele, on the other hand, is rendered in two dimensions. She's pure physical appearance and manual action without interiority. And I think this dynamic really kicks into gear again during the duo's final interaction, which is right at the end of the poem. And this is the last passage on this slide. Meanwhile, Cybele, too industrious maid, draws forth the bread, which Simulus gladly receives in his hands And now that the fear of hunger is driven away, carefree for the day, he wraps his legs in a pair of gaiters and, covered with a cap, forces his submissive bullocks under their leather-bound yokes and drives them to the fields, there in the earth, burying his plough. So all told, this is a much nicer and a kind of less gruff encounter between these two characters than in other parts of the poem. So smiling, bread in hand, his basic material requirements met, Simulus can now leap up a rung on the pyramid of human needs, and the poem concomitantly takes it up a notch. Now Simulus gets a full-on arming scene, kitted out like an epic warrior, dominating his beasts, entering the ploughing register of Virgil Georgic's Book 1. Again, surprise, surprise, the man gets promoted for doing basically nothing. But what I want to point out is this very subtle counterpose between two words, I think, for earthwork, aka two metaphors which I've highlighted in this passage: eruit on the one hand and condit on the other. So eruo is to dig something out, literally, and it's Skibily's task to dig out the bread, just as she cleaned space for it before. But in this act of digging, she both takes Simulus's place. So just before in the poem, when Simulus was in the garden, when he was gathering all of the material for the Maritum, he literally sort of got his hands dirty by digging up garlic and herbs. So on the one hand, you know, Skibily takes his place, and yet she doesn't quite manage to take his place, because ultimately you shouldn't have to dig bread. Digging is a sort of lower order activity in the Scala Naturae of this little country paradise. So I guess my point is the only metaphor that Skibily is really allowed in this poem actually does an inverse operation on her. Eruit sort of brings her low. It makes, you know, this neutral and relatively simple activity of removing the bread from the oven into something sort of dirtier than it needs to be. Simulus, on the other hand, gets this 5-star condit treatment. Okay, so Simulus gets the opposite ground level activity of burying something in the earth rather than removing something from it, you know, of something that ties in with sowing, planting, founding. Okay, so I don't need to tell you guys that it's one of the buzzwords for Aeneas's Catistic miracle in the Aeneid, you know, right at the end of the Aeneid. Plunging the sword in Turnus is an act of, you know, condit is an act of foundation. And I also note that eruo can be used of raising cities to the ground rather than founding them. So I wonder if there's a sort of hint of feminized threat and destruction in Skibily here too. So while Skibily is finally allowed to enter the world of a very subtle metaphor, it's a metaphor that brings the low lower. Simulus, lucky guy, is raised higher than ever to Aenean proportions, and their drifting apart is cleverly inscribed through metaphors staking different relationships to the earth, digging out and or raising on the one hand versus sinking in and building on the other. Okay, I want to genuinely end this time, by offering two versions of how the poet of the Maritum fits into all of this. And these are two versions which pivot around a shift in my thinking on this poem and ancient authorship in general, which have arisen from the various layers of work in giving this paper at the first Work Life workshop, and then again at UCLA a few months later. In the earlier version, I assumed, for reasons we might want to talk about in the discussion, that the ideological stance of the Maritum poet was more or less aligned with the slave-owning Roman elite. Hence my thoughts about how metaphor acts as this kind of extra-diegetic firewall in the poem. Highbrow poet can make lovely metaphors beautifully, self-consciously, whereas Simulus is blissfully unaware that the pesto he's smashing together is anything close to high art rather than daily grind. Now, after talking to people like Amy Richland and Francesca Martelli, I'm not sure that that account is actually up to the job. So I leave you with an alternative thought experiment. What if we made use of this poem's anonymity to take it in another direction entirely? What if we imagined it as the work not of the usual slave-owning, hexameter crafting elite, but of someone, perhaps a grammarian or similar, who had themselves experienced transplantation and enslavement, like our good Skibberley? We know that there were lots of hyperliterate and hyperliterary enslaved people and freedmen filling out secretarial and other duties in upper class Roman houses. And of course, Joe Howley's forthcoming classic is going to shine the spotlight on them. So some of these figures could well have been behind the bits and bobs of pseudepigrapha and adespota that eventually got folded under Daddy Virgil's wing. So what if our pesto poem was the product of someone with direct experience, A, of being themselves subaltern in some way, and B, of seeing up close the annoying posh Roman habit of aestheticizing the life of the poor? We could then see the Maritim as an incredibly sharp hatchet job, not necessarily buying into this discourse of aestheticization, but perhaps exposing it for the puffed up, patronizing bollocks it is. For in the end, Maritim is the only ancient poem I know to show how art in a slave society is a zero-sum game. The elevation of one humble being into the high register is completely dependent on the subjugation and maintenance of another humble being in the low register. You can't have a Simulus cooking up miracles without a Skibberley cleaning up shit, nor can you have the work of poetry without the work of the enslaved on which it ultimately depends. Thanks very much.